I can see that as being absolutely requisite. Maybe somebody who's just deeply in touch with their emotions. If you have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn in it to Luke, the very first chapter. This is where we're going to spend our time today. Dr. Luke gives us really the most detailed account of Jesus that we have. If you take Matthew and Mark, you take all the material therein, some of it is similar to Luke. There's a whole theory about this wherein you take the three synoptic gospels and you say, well, how much of Matthew is found in Mark? How much of Mark is found in Luke? How much of Matthew is in Luke? How much of Luke is found? The interesting thing is all of the combinant features are there, and then Luke adds about 30% more material in terms of what Jesus' life and movements were that aren't common to either Matthew or Mark or John. There's a good study to do when you do the study of the Gospels. It's the study of unintended coincidences. That is, you take a historical feature. One of the Gospels records Jesus at his trial being slapped and asked, who struck you? And you think to yourself when you read that account, well, gosh, I guess he could just look there and say he did it. But then you read another gospel and you find out he was blindfolded, which is not in the gospel where that's put. So you can put these features together and assemble a greater and more detailed history than any one gospel as it's given. And Luke's gospel is one that's not an eyewitness in terms of the first person. Luke is not an eyewitness. Luke is one who interviewed eyewitnesses and then assembled his gospel like Mark. Matthew and John are eyewitnesses, a different way of looking at it. But Luke is a very careful chronicler of this particular history. So here on this fifth Sunday of Lent, and I guess everybody knows what Lent is, it's the 40 days prior to Easter, where in the Roman Catholic tradition, a person tries to focus their lives in being more repentant and more careful about the way in which they live before the Lord. Let's take a look at the text and see what we could glean from it. It'll be Luke chapter 1, and I'll begin reading in verse 1. Since many have undertaken to set in order a narrative concerning those matters which have been fulfilled among us, even as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having traced the course of things accurately from the first, to write in order, most excellent Theophilus, that you might know the certainty concerning the things in which you've been instructed. So Luke begins this gospel by explaining exactly what his intention is with this person. Now, some people have looked at Theophilus and said, well, that must be some kind of title. No, the word literally means God's friend. That's what it means. From theos, which is the Greek word for God, and phileo, which is the Greek word for one of the four loves that the Bible holds in Greek to be, which is the love you have for a friend. I don't know if you remember when Jesus and John, at the very last, when Jesus asks Peter, do you love me? And the first time Jesus asks that, he says, do you agape me? That is, do you love me with the love of God? The third time he asks him, he says, do you phileo me? Do you love me with the love of a friend? So Luke is very thorough in his investigation. Luke is not a Jew. He's a Gentile. He's not a Jew. And he clearly, if you read Luke and you look at the parallels between Mark and Matthew, you will see that Luke has certainly spoken, at the very least, with Matthew and Mark. It'd be asking too much of a historian to not see that the parallels are almost verbatim in some instances. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, here are two, with the case of Matthew, an eyewitness. Why not interview him to find out what he saw? But Luke's account is not only one of the most, it is the most detailed gospel, it's actually one of the most detailed ancient histories we have. And the reason I say that is because Luke is chronicling something that has been only 25 or 30 years past. In other words, a lot of the people who saw this stuff are still walking around. Now, if you take somebody like Alexander the Great, the best history we have of him is Plutarch. Plutarch writes almost 400 years later, so he can't interview anybody. Everybody's long gone. He's having to gather his information as a good historian, but still, he's not in touch with eyewitnesses. Luke was, clearly was. I mean, after all, Luke travels with Paul. So you can see this, and again, as a side note to once again buttress Luke as a good chronicler, you see in Luke's Acts, the Acts which are written by Luke, they're really a continuance of the gospel. If you read the last of Luke and then begin reading the first of Acts, you'll see almost it's straight through. He's almost taking you from the crucifixion, the resurrection of Jesus, and then to what? The resurrection, the ascension, Pentecost, and the various things that occurred right after. So he's chronicling the same thing. And at one portion in Acts, he begins to say we, which means Luke is now traveling with them in Acts, traveling with Paul. He's obviously a very humble believer because he remains in the background of his gospel and of Acts. Even though he uses the word we, you don't see him doing anything, really. You just see him chronicling what's being done by those he deems important in the chronicle. He's probably writing, he probably chronicled in the 40s when he was traveling with Paul. He's probably assembling all this in the 50s or 60s. So we're talking 25 or 30 years after the crucifixion and resurrection. There'd be a lot of people around who remembered that very, very well. And he was with Paul right to the end of Paul's life. So it seems important, he deemed it important, that this orderly account be assembled. But he said, he closes his sentence, his preamble, with this, about which you, Theophilus, have been instructed. Now this is where I want to spend some time, because this is where it's so important. Lots of believers become believers without any instruction at all. I did. Probably most of us in this room. I don't know that anybody in this room, maybe you did. I don't want to speak for anybody. But that you've analyzed all the philosophical arguments against the existence of God, and you analyzed all the historical data relative to the Gospels and decided that the Gospels were good history. You looked at all the evidences for the resurrection of Jesus being an historical event, and you assembled all that in your mind, and then you became a Christian. I doubt that's the case. Now, it might be for somebody in here, but I doubt it. Most of us come to Jesus on what would be called in philosophy as an existential experience. That is, we hear the gospel, we think it to be so, it makes sense to us, and I'm going to say God enters into that moment supernaturally and makes it, helps it to make sense to us, and we reach out with everything we know about ourselves to everything we know about Him, and we ask for salvation. I think that's what most people do, don't you? That seems to be the case. So many elements of what we believe get left to the rubric of faith and nothing more. When Nancy mentioned the eggs at Easter, that we should pray that the Easter eggs and the bunnies and the baskets and everything else and the whatever you call that purple grass that they put in the bottom of the Easter baskets should lead us to Jesus, she's making a good point. In other words, for a lot of people, they become Christians on the basis of that existential moment, that moment in their lives where they see it, they believe it, they ask for it, God enters into the moment, they become born again, but that's where they stop. That's where a lot of people stop. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying it's wrong. But clearly Luke felt that Theophilus needed something beyond that experience. Theophilus is already a believer, about which you have been instructed, Theophilus. So Theophilus is already there. But maybe there's something that Theophilus doesn't have that Luke thinks is important for him to have. You see, here's my contention, and you can think about this yourself in your own way. Nothing of the sentimentality of Easter means anything unless it's real. Nothing. It might as well be, I heard you guys talking in there today about St. Patrick's Day. I don't even know what that's about. Do you? I know it's got something to do with shamrocks and green, and there's a parade or two. That's all I know. I don't know anything about the tradition there. I know that it's a Roman Catholic observation. It's probably got some deep history. I've never looked into it because I just got to be honest about it. It doesn't bother me one way or the other. I'm not interested in it. So for me, if I were to observe St. Patrick's Day, it would be purely sentimental. Now, for a lot of people, it's an opportunity to imbibe alcohol and enjoy that aspect of their lives. I know that that's the case in a lot of the bigger cities, kind of like the Mummers Parade in Philadelphia, just a whole bunch of inebriated people in funny costumes walking along down the street. But is it any wonder to you that in Western Europe and the United States that the churches are emptying, if all we've got is the sentimentality? I've got a friend, a good friend, and I'm not saying this to be disparaging at all, but it does concern me, who says, I like gospel music. Now, I think to myself, well, gee, that's great, but do you like the tunes, or do you like the content of what the gospel music you like is actually saying? Does the content strike your heart because you've had an experience with God and you've been instructed so that you know something about what the content of the songs actually means? Or is it just a sentimental feature for you? We've not had that conversation because I respect this person and I don't really feel an urgent need to challenge that in them. But I think it's a valid question to ask. Let me ask you this, and I want you to think about this really hard. Seriously, think about this. Could you remain a Christian believer if you found out that none of this in the New Testament were true? Don't answer the question, just think about it. If you found out that none of this was true, could you remain a believer? Now, I'm going to say, I could not. I could not. That's how confident I am that it is true. Think about this for a minute. Every Easter, especially Easter, it happens at Christmas, but Easter is a quantum magnitude greater in terms of the numbers of documentaries and things on TV and magazine articles and internet articles and everything else trying to demonstrate that there's something new about Jesus' life and death and resurrection that we've never seen before. And if only we would see it, then we would know something about Jesus we didn't know before that. And I noticed something about nearly all of them. They're every one of them trying to subvert the fact that Jesus actually came back from the tomb alive in history. All of them. So what's going on? I think you and I are very much right to be suspicious of any article, especially if it says there's something new information about Jesus. I'd love to see that. I haven't seen it now for 40 years. I'm not saying it's not there, but until I see it, I'm not going to believe it. But we should be suspicious about anybody who tells us there's something new, especially if the new thing is we really shouldn't believe it at all, because it didn't happen in history. That's what's being peddled every year, even in Lowe's of all places. You go to Lowe's, I'm going there to buy a screwdriver, and there's an example, a magazine article up there, new information about Jesus. Did he really rise? And I'm thinking, in Lowe's? Come on. But there it is. There it is. There's something going on. And why? Because if you can undermine anything to do with the gospel record, then you can bring into question everything to do with the gospel record. To diminish the historicity of the events is then to diminish somebody's confidence that what they've believed is true. And if it's not true, would you remain a believer? You see how that works? Oh, it's very clever. It's all a matter of faith, right? That's the line, and that's the line that I think is Satan's best tool. If it's all only about faith, then if you can get a person, and this doesn't apply to everybody, don't misunderstand me, there are people who come to God with, as I said, everything they know about themselves to everything they know about Jesus, and they ask for salvation, and God saves them right then and there. I don't have any doubts about that, so don't misunderstand me here. But I can tell you there are lots of them who get up to that point, they see one of these articles, and they walk away unsaved. It's all a matter of faith, you see. That's all. I don't know if you, I'm gonna guess here. I'm gonna say there's only one other person in this room. Now, I could be wrong about this. Think about it. who likes science fiction a lot. Only one other that I know of. Now, I'm not saying you may love it, but I'm just saying in my experience with you all in this room, I only know of one. So in that, one of the things in science fiction, it's just like a fable or a fairy tale. They build a world. It's called world building in novel writing. If you write a fictional work, you want to build a world, whether it's a very local world like the inside of a house, or it's a great big world like an entire civilization. You want to build a world. C.S. Lewis built 3 worlds in his science fiction novels. Out of the Silent Planet, first one, Paralander, the second one, and That Hideous Strength, the third one. Now, he wrote them as parallels to the gospel, but most writers aren't interested in that. But even so, he built a world, and in these world-building science fiction novels and movies, there's always some kind of religious structure, always. But it's always mere faith. Have you ever noticed that? There's nothing real there. In other words, it's just what people believe. There's no history. They don't point to any facts about anything. They point to it as something where people love the sentimental and what would be called the aesthetic qualities of getting together and having rituals, but there's no reality. And it satisfies them. I'm going to tell you, there are a lot of people sitting in churches all over the country, all over the world, who are satisfied with the aesthetics of the ritual and the music and the gathering, and they do not believe any of it to be based on anything but just that, mere faith. Lots of them. And so all the good sentiments in the holy days that we observe can be nothing but that, sentiments based on mere faith. You see, for something to really matter to us, if we're rational people, it's got to be about something real and about something important. If Jesus rose from the grave in history, not only is it very real, but it's very important, because now everything he said becomes true. If he didn't rise, then he just said some stuff, right? Like all the rest of the mob. Aristotle, Plato, Confucius, and everybody else. So a person who believes this way, that it's all just faith, they love the aesthetic qualities of gathering, they love the music, they love the ritual, they can do their bit at Lent, Ash Wednesday, and everything else. They can do their bit in a Baptist church, a Lutheran church, a Methodist church, any church, through Easter, and then they can walk away from it and set it aside. I'm done with that. And what happens is there's a feature in this that's incentivized that I think is, I hate to say it this way, but this is what I think. I think it's satanic. It is that the person who does those things, who's observant, who is so enamored with the aesthetics, the sentimentality, can observe the things in a church and believe that that is sufficient, that they think themselves then to be better people for having done it, for having been so observant, for having thought about the things that they're hearing about while believing none of them. Man, can you imagine the horror of waking up in front of the God you never believed in and finding out that all of that stuff that you were so sentimental about doesn't carry any weight at all because you never believed it to be true? Man, the power of the gospel is its reality. Don't ever let anybody tell you otherwise. God did not ask us to believe a lie. A fairy tale is a lie, period. It's fun. I love fairy tales. I grew up reading them. But I didn't believe anything. I didn't believe there were dragons. I didn't believe that Aladdin rode around on a carpet that could fly. I loved reading about it, but I didn't believe it to be so. Luke's orderly account is a history. And if it's a history, then everybody who reads it now has a decision to make. A real decision. You can't escape the decision. That's the raw edge that history provides. We either believe it or not. There's the instruction, the investigation of that which is historical, so that when we believe something, there's something we can stand back from it. I don't know what it's like for you. Maybe this is just peculiar to me. But to stand back from that moment where I said yes to Jesus and turn back to everything that it's grounded in to find out if I've really believed rightly, that matters to me. The subjective feelings, the subjective decision followed by the objective where I can find it, which confirms my subjective decision. I have believed rightly. Right? That matters. There's not a shortcut for that. That's why Luke says, about which you have been instructed. There's something that has to happen. I love this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this history. Maybe you all are. Poor Galileo. Galileo was in the 16th century as an astronomer, and he made a telescope. Early telescopes. I mean, they were crude. They didn't do that good a job, but he could actually see Jupiter. He could actually see Saturn. He could see these planets, and he looked at them in the way in which they moved and the fact that they had phases where the sun would only shine on part of the planet and it would change. The shadowing would change. And he realized, Shazam, the earth is not in the middle of the universe. Now, up until Galileo, that was what was thought. All the way back to Aristotle. Aristotle's picture, back then, a philosopher was a scientist. They were one and the same. And when Aristotle looked at the universe, his model had the earth at the center and everything, the sun and everything else going around the earth. The church, the church is founded in the 1st century, only 300 years after Aristotle. That's the best science they had. And if you think about it, if you just stand on the earth, you see the sun march over the sky, you think, well, the sun's going around us. That's the way it looks. And so the science was flawed, but it was the proper science for what they had to do. It wasn't until Galileo and a telescope started to tell him, wait a minute, if the shadows on that planet are different to me, that means I'm in a different spot. I'm in a different spot. That means we're moving. We're not stationary. We're not, as the Bible says, on pillars that never move. That's not a scientific statement. That's a biblical statement. So, poor Galileo, this is what he said. He said, in his trial, you see, he went on trial for this because the church had believed that the earth was at the center of the cosmos and everything moved around it. And Galileo said, that is not how it looks in a telescope. What are we going to do? Galileo was a Christian. Galileo did not do this because he just wanted to challenge the church. He did it because that's what he found. Just like if you go and you pick up a rock and you throw it and it falls to the ground, you think, something's going on there that makes the rock come back. So Galileo said this in his trial before Cardinal Bellarmine. And before you think Cardinal Bellarmine to be some evil inquisitor, he wasn't. You know what he said to Galileo? He said, if you can provide us with a demonstration to show us that the Aristotelian model of the earth at the center of the cosmos is incorrect, then we will change our view. But Galileo wasn't ready for the demonstration. It took his follower, Copernicus, to bring that about. But here's what Galileo said at his trial. Now, think about this relative to the gospel and what we believe. This is an incredible statement. He says, it is surely harmful to souls to make it a heresy to believe what is proved to be so. The heart cannot rejoice in what the mind will not accept. Is that not true? Can I rejoice if I'm willing to look hard in the gospel if I can't accept it? That's true. But the beauty of it is God has provided plenty of historical evidence for our minds if they're open, so that our hearts then can accept that which is true. God has provided a witness. And so I just say to anybody in this room, maybe if you're settled in your life as a follower of Jesus without any of the evidentiary features being important to you, awesome. I'm not trying to knock that out of you. But those who are on the edges of this, who think that the gospel is just merely a faith position with no history behind it, therefore unchallenged and unreinforced, is it any wonder that people can hear the story on Easter and walk away unchanged? Is it any wonder at all? No reality, therefore no challenge, no problem, just move on and get on with real life out there. I don't want to live like that. And God has provided me plenty of evidence that I don't have to. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you got a question, you want to pray with me,